How does somebody go from D&D to Warhammer, two games that are completely different from each other? Well, actually, quarantine. Quarantine was the reason why I got into Warhammer. Tony Sticks here from TonySticks.com, and here's a really interesting topic. Why quarantine is the best time to get into Warhammer, and how a role player went into Warhammer. Because as we all know, this year took quite a turn that none of us thought it was going to take. Funny enough, I even made a video at the beginning of this year talking about how much I love D&D, and how one of my goals is to run a D&D session once a month, every month at the minimum, and to finish my current campaign, which is Curse of Strahd. Unfortunately, it didn't go that way. You know, everybody had to isolate and be distant and be quarantined. So yeah, no more D&D sessions. That was quite a bummer, actually. But rather than being sad about that whole thing, I decided to be proactive. And part of D&D is a lot of miniatures. You use miniatures for combat, the dynamic combat. You use miniatures for your party, which some of them I actually custom paint, some of them I custom 3D print. Like, this is the current party in my D&D campaign. Yes, one of them is a elephant, because there's always that one player who picks a exquisite race. But with no D&D sessions and everybody in quarantine, I decided, you know, I'm gonna be proactive and just start painting all the villains, all the monsters, all the bad guys that they're gonna encounter in this current campaign, and maybe even get a head start on the next one. But about a month into quarantine, I ended up painting most of the villains and the characters that the players are actually going to be facing, and I needed to find something new to do, like a new hobby. And I don't know and don't have a date for when I can continue my in-person D&D campaigns. So rather than just sitting around and thinking about that, I decided to be proactive and experiment with a new hobby that I wanted to try for a while, and that was Warhammer. Because anytime I enter a board game shop, there's always two big games. There's Dungeons and Dragons, and then there's Warhammer. And Warhammer was always a game I wanted to try, but I was just so immersed with D&D, and there's a lot of D&D going on. I just didn't have the time. Quarantine was actually the best time for that. So I started to research the rules and the different armies and what I needed to do to start playing Warhammer. Turns out, obviously, if you're playing a big army game like Warhammer, you need an army. And that's a big obstacle for most people, especially since Warhammer miniatures are not the cheapest thing ever. And here's the thing about Warhammer. You don't know if you're gonna like Warhammer until you actually start playing it. So I don't know anybody who plays Warhammer when I got into it, so I had to kind of figure it out along the way, and I didn't want to go in and buy an army that I ended up not liking or ended up not enjoying the game. So in order for me to justify the purchase of buying these expensive models, I wanted it to double over into D&D, just in case I didn't like Warhammer. So the two main armies I was thinking about playing was demons and orcs. Orcs because they're D&D, you know, orcs are everywhere. And demons because my next D&D campaign is going to be Descent into Avernus, a demon hell-based campaign. So right before I came to the conclusion of buying a demon army, I stumbled over a bunch of 3D print files for orcs. And I have a 3D printer, and this light bulb clicked in my head. Why don't I just 3D print a bunch of orcs and have an orc army? This truly would be the most cost-effective way to get into Warhammer. Now, if you're curious what 3D printer I used and what were these orc files that I found, it's going to be in the description down below so you can take a look at it. So with my 3D printer during quarantine, I decided to print orcs back to back to back, and then before you know it, I ended up with a little army of 3D printed orcs. And I'm sure a bunch of you diehard Warhammer fans are gonna hate me for this, because you're gonna say, oh, that's not an official Warhammer army, those are 3D printed, you can never use those in tournaments. And well, I'm not trying to attend tournaments, I just want to learn the game. And part of the whole Warhammer experience is actually getting, building, and painting models, so I ended up actually buying a couple that I thought were a really good value. So half my army is like a group of 3D printed orcs, and the other half of my army is actual Warhammer model orcs, which I actually really did enjoy painting the actual Warhammer models because the level of detail they have is extreme, and there's a lot of customability you can do with them. And speaking of customizable orcs, The orc community for Warhammer is all about building ridiculous models and coming up with whatever creative things you can throw together. Like, take for instance these two things I found on Reddit. We have a Mr. Potato Head, like, weird mech monster that this guy created with an actual Mr. Potato Head. And take this one, which is a orc hiding in a barrel. The only parts he really used is arms and guns. No torso, no head, no feet. It's creative, and I like that. And all that gave me ideas to get into the game without burning my wallet. Like, take this for example. There's one model that I really want, which is this orc guy called Ghazghkull Thraka. And the only way you can get this model is with a $200 box set with a bunch of other models that you don't need. But coming from D&D, I have a bunch of leftover unpainted models that I still haven't finished. One of which was a $8 hill giant model from Reaper Minis that I just ended up painting as a giant orc. I gave him a custom base size, the exact size of Ghazghkull Thraka, and his body height and shape is pretty much the same. So there you go. Like, I didn't have to buy a $200 box set. I just used an $8 miniature that from D&D. So great. I found a way to get into Warhammer cheaply, and it was fun. It really was a lot of fun building this army. So much fun that a couple of my friends have caught on to me building this army, and they decided to get into Warhammer as well. So look at that. I found some people that wanted to learn the game with me, which ties into another point why quarantine was kind of a great stepping stone and a way to get into Warhammer right now, because Warhammer is a game that's one-on-one, where you're far apart from each other managing armies. D&D is a group game where a lot of people sit around a table. With the current state of the world, big group gatherings of a lot of people aren't something that people should be doing, but this is why Warhammer is so good, because you have a lot of time to yourself in quarantine to build an army, and it is a one-on-one game, so you don't have to worry about big group gatherings. And I gotta say, I love D&D and I love being a DM, but it is a lot of work. Every time I do a D&D session, there's a lot of upfront work that comes into it, of me planning the encounters, what they're going to face, prepping the monsters, prepping the custom battlefields. Not to mention, I also have to schedule around 6 other players, which is what my D&D game was. And now with Warhammer, and now that I have an army, I pick it up and I go. Yeah, you can build a custom battlefield, but that's pretty easy. You just plop some buildings in line of sight, and there you go, you're set. The hard part of Warhammer is done. You built an army, now you pick up and go and play. And you might be thinking, well, how much fun can you really have with Warhammer? Because D&D is this creative game where you role play and act and stuff, and then with Warhammer you kind of shoot your opponent and kill him, and that's it. Actually, no. The way I play Warhammer is I have a deck of open war cards. Link in the description if you want to see what I'm talking about. But it's a deck of cards that provide you with 3 things: a random way you deploy on the map, a random objective, and a random thing, special rule that hinders the game, whether it be your models can only move a certain distance, there's a fog that makes it hard for your models to shoot over a certain distance, just a bunch of little rules that spice up the game. So every time I play Warhammer, it's different and challenging, which is something that's really important to me because I came from competitive card games. And there are 2 big things that are a problem with competitive card games. Is 1, they are repetitive because you don't have a lot of options. You draw your 5, 6, 7 cards that you can hold in your hand, and those are your options. But most of the time, card games are designed to be a killing combo. 1, 2, 3, you're dead. You're playing the exact same thing. I would call it auto chess. You're kind of a vessel for your deck, and the deck plays itself. That's not the case with Warhammer because you have a lot of troops that have a lot of different abilities. And then you have these things called stratagems, which is other abilities that you can access at will. And every unit has different weapons it can shoot. And how do you want to shoot those weapons? And do you want to split fire those weapons? And if you do split fire those weapons, how many shots? And do you want to take the risk of charging this guy into melee combat? And it is so many options, and it is completely reactionary depending on how your opponent plays. And because most card games are kill your opponent, Warhammer isn't kill your opponent. You can kill your opponent, but That's not necessarily how you're always going to win, because nowadays, especially with the 9th edition of the game, it's objectives. Go play objectives. It's loads of fun, and I can't wait to play more. Now, here's the other problem with card games. Card games make you buy more cards because your old ones are outdated. Magic the Gathering rotates the old cards out, and they're no longer, you can't play them anymore in the competitive play. They're just done. Cardfight Vanguard, another card game I used to play, would just make units more and more ridiculous, and extra decks that you would have to buy and add, to the point where your old ones just didn't matter anymore. You build a deck, and 6 months later, it is the worst thing ever compared to the newest cards that came out. Warhammer is a game that's been around for a little over 30 years. And here's what's interesting about that. Yes, sometimes they release new models and discontinue old ones, but that doesn't happen very often. In fact, a lot of the models that people still play with, they've been playing with for 20 years. Yes, Warhammer makes new models and encourages you to buy the new models, but once you build an army, you kind of have it for life. And one of the ways Warhammer makes money is by updating the rules constantly and encouraging you to just buy the new rules. At this point, we are on the 9th edition of the game, and on average, I would say every 3 to 4 years, a new edition of Warhammer comes out. So when the new rules for Warhammer come out, they spice up the game. Some armies become not so good, some armies do become good, but most importantly about that whole thing is they'll release things called codexes, like this is a Drukhari codex, Dark Elves. They are my next army. Yeah, that's how much I like this game. I'm already planning a second army. But they release codexes, which updates your models and gives them different abilities. And so your units, you build them and they're there for life because they're constantly getting refreshed throughout the game's lifespan. So at this point, I'm in love, and I'm really happy that I stumbled over Warhammer and was able to really get into this game, especially in these difficult times where you do spend a lot of time by yourself and isolated and away from people. I was able to take that time to build and create this new project, passion thing that I'm now going to have for life, and I'm able to enjoy it now safely, unlike I would with D&D, which requires, again, a group tight setting that isn't the best thing right now. So there you have it. That is how quarantine got me into Warhammer and how a D&D player turned into a wargaming player. Now, I'm not giving up on D&D. I love D&D and I cannot wait to start playing D&D again. It is one of the most rewarding things you could ever do, and there's so much beauty and magic that comes with it. But until then, I'm gonna have a lot of fun experimenting with this new hobby that I found of what is Warhammer and the crazy amount of lore and rules that I need to learn moving forward. It is going to be a lot of fun. If you found this video enjoyable, please hit that like button. It is super helpful. And until then, this has been Tony Sticks, and may you stay safe and have a fantastic day. Boatloads.